and then we'll hand over to Billy. But first of all, thank you to everybody who has joined. We want to make this space available tonight or today or wherever you are to discuss emergencies, particularly in the education space. We want to promote ADRA's framework. Billy's going to talk more about that. If you're a country office that has undertaken a risk assessment and decided that education, DRR or protection are critical response sectors for you, then we welcome your participation. Also, if you're an ERT roster member and you want more tools in your toolkit for when you potentially will deploy to a significant disaster, we welcome your participation now. My name's Michael Peach, and I'll be joined by Billy, who will be hosting this session for the next hour. Unfortunately, Jonathan Telfer, who was going to be co-presenting from ADRA Norway, has been unable to join us. But we also want to thank the Education TLL for their work, particularly with the Education Emergencies framework and its application over the last couple of years. Since this was launched in early 2020, at the same time as COVID really struck the world and our ADRA network, we had an opportunity to apply the Education Emergencies framework. Back then, we put $1.5 million into 5 country offices, each receiving $300,000 to actually apply the framework and get some learning. So we also want to share those and to look at ways that we can continually improve that. One of the commitments that came out of the framework too was to continue to look at ways to train the network, to build capacity around education in emergencies. And so we just want to use this opportunity now also to bring this to your attention if you haven't been aware of it before, to share ideas. We'll talk for a little while. We'll also then open it up and would like your feedback, some of the learnings that you've had, whether they are smaller responses or some of the protracted crises that we see around the world. If you've got experience, we'd love to hear your feedback on that and how this has worked or how we can continue to improve this space as a network. So let me just do one quick plug also for another webinar that's happening in a couple of weeks on December 14, which is also focusing on child protection in education. And we would like to we've got an external consultant which will be sharing then as well. So we want to continue this theme. So watch out for an opportunity to spend another hour as a bit of a masterclass as we find ways to look at building more capacity and awareness in the network. So let me just open with a word of prayer and then I'll hand over to Billy. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity to meet. I know everyone's busy. We just want to carve out 1 hour to discuss and to share, to look at ways that we can better equip ourselves for disasters as they continue to be problematic for us around the world. We thank you for this opportunity. We know it's always been one of the key critical areas of ADRA, education, and we just want to use this opportunity now to share and discuss and to make opportunities to do better work into the future. We pray in your precious name, amen. All right, Billy, I'll hand over to you and we'll be back to have some Q&A in a little while's time. Thank you.
Sounds good. Hello, everybody. I hope you can see my screen. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you today or this morning or this evening. And the purpose of this presentation is a toolkit. It's something you can add to your toolkit about what else can you do in emergencies. We are transitioning a lot, I think, for the past decade into novel ways of responding to emergencies. I'd say traditionally, education is never thought of as having a role in emergencies. And I hope that this presentation will expose you to the resources, the possibilities, and also the importance of education in emergencies. Before I get started, I just wanted to share how a clear example is the Ukraine crisis. I know us as a network with ADRA, we invested a lot in the Ukraine crisis, and it's very interesting that the people that the beneficiaries that we serve, we group them as adults, not realizing that almost within the first months of the Ukraine crisis, 4 million children were escaping the crisis out of nearly 7 million. And yet, as an organization that I want to say very child friendly, did we have a mechanism to respond to children? We have photos of children on our website. We have photos of children in our packages when we're, sharing news and um, our success stories and our reports. And it seems that we weren't prepared for the amount of people coming out of Ukraine, especially those in Europe, but more the majority of the people escaping. I don't think there was a unified plan on how to respond to that. Well, although I can't give you the silver bullet, I can tell you that education creates this platform that has been used by other organizations to respond to children during emergencies, and we'll dive more into this. Um, so our agenda for today is basically going over a few items. One is what is education emergencies. The acronym is EIE, and also what is NEMP. You can see in the subtitle of the first slide that how to essentially implement that into your NEMP practice. We're not forcing people to implement education as part of their NEMP. But what we want to do is provide the tools that if you are um, able to do that, if you want to know how to develop education emergencies in a response, then these are some of the opportunities available. There was a typo in there, but yeah, no, actually, I meant to say why education emergencies and NEMP or responses. And then the fourth one is how. So the tools and methodologies. So just giving you some best practices, and we'll transition afterwards into Q&A. So first of all, what is education in emergencies? Just by a show of hands, I mean, you can also put it on the chat or just raise your hands. I want to get a feel who knows about education in emergencies. Let me see. Okay, well, I'll take it that I see Pabruk knows about it. Um, okay, well, so it's not something very familiar to a lot of people, and that's totally okay. And this is the purpose of this webinar, is just to expose to you, in a sense, what you're missing in the world of emergencies. So education emergencies, in a nutshell, is basically a learning opportunity for children or even non adults during times of emergencies. Um, yes, people need food. Yes, people need water, depending on the circumstances. But it's providing a space or a mechanism for learning to continue during a time of instability. Traditionally, education and emergency programming in time of crisis have been child-centered. And there is a good reason for that. Like I shared with you with the Ukraine crisis, the majority of them were children. So imagine Ukraine is happening. Let's say Ukraine number two is happening. And we have great food distribution programs. We have great NFI distribution programs. We have, cash voucher programming. But how can you distribute cash vouchers when most of the kids are by themselves? They are unaccompanied children. how can you distribute that when children don't even have the families to go with them? They are just by themselves. How can you deliver most of your how can you do most of your responses when the majority of the population is not even part of your mechanism for those responses? It's just we have the opportunity now to adapt to the situation. Let's say if in an emergency, the majority of the people that are being responded to are children. The question is, do we as an organization or in your local office, do you have a backup plan, a plan ready that if children are the majority of the people who are in need, how can we help? So education is emergency is basically like this a platform when you can exercise those opportunities. And one of the great things about education emergencies is that you can it's intersectoral, meaning that you can adapt, you can include other sectors into it, like peace building, like disaster risk reduction, WASH, hygiene promotion. So all these things can be part of education emergencies, and also protection, which is one of the things that is very important. You know by now that during times of crisis, children are at risk. They are very vulnerable. Trafficking is all-time high. When children are being displaced, people do take advantage of them. We are living in a sinful world, unfortunately, and people do take advantage of kids who are vulnerable by themselves, and unfortunately with little protection. Um, I believe during COVID, there was a uptick in child pregnancy, and South Sudan document that. And when we did the response there, we find out that yes, indeed, like because nobody was going to school, unfortunately, the kids were, at home, and you had a lot of uptick in teenage pregnancies. Um, so not being able to, so how can education still in a sense, minister to children who are being impacted by these crises? And we have an opportunity to do that. We have an opportunity to respond to that. We have an opportunity to not do everything as it has been done before, or as in other offices doing it, or as traditionally that's how we do it. So we're just going to keep doing things like that. No, we can adapt to the situation, adapt to your local context. And education emergency is one of those tools that you can do those adaptation among many. But the purpose of this webinar is basically to educate you about one of those tools that are available. Um, and Also, what is a NEMP? I'm assuming most of you know what a NEMP is, so I won't dwell too much on it. But for those of you who are very new to it, it's a national emergency management plan that's every ADRA office is expected to have in during times of emergencies. And the goal is to provide an action plan in the event of that crisis or emergency. It basically has a list of pre-approved response plans. We call them menus. So they come with, if something happens, these are the people available to respond. This is the budget that we're gonna have. This is our methodology. If we're doing distribution of any kind, maybe cash vouchers, cash transfers, food, health, um, mental health services, then it's already there. So the benefit is when their emergency happens, instead of going through the long process of submitting a proposal, getting that approved, making those corrections, and the emergency is still happening, and we're still caught up in that administrative, slow administrative movement, then the NEMP can be activated very fast. We don't have to go through that process because it's pre-approved. So that's the big benefit of the NEMP. Unfortunately, what we've observed is that a lot of NEMPs tend to be the same. They are very typical for what we do. There's a lot of food distribution. Recently, we've been transitioning into something more efficient, like cash vouchers, which is good. But can we what if your office is focused on something that's different? Let's say if your strength is not in food distribution, but it is in, let's say, child protection, or let's say if it's in disaster reduction, or in this context, if your strength is in education. So how can you adapt it to your local context? So NEMP provides, let's say, the opportunity for you to respond to your local context as traditionally, as historically um, it has been the case. So if you haven't started your NEMP, please do so. We really encourage every country office to have one available. Um, Going back to the Ukraine crisis, a lot of the European countries didn't have NIMPs, and Ukraine happened. So now uh, the regional office and also the offices in Europe sees the importance of also having a NIMP. It's not just the NIMP is not just for countries who are developing countries, or countries who are yeah, let's say, quote unquote, poor. Now everybody needs to have a NIMP, because you really don't know when you'll be next on the disaster list. um, so yeah, so that's a plug for NIMP. Going back to education emergencies. So why is education emergencies important in our emergency plans? I already covered the fact that children are very vulnerable during emergencies, and that's something that we cannot ignore. If you were part of an emergency, I know you will be very keen on taking care of your family. Um, your children are exposed to all those crises, and most of the aid that's given, do you think that all of them are catered to children? The sad answer is no. Not all responses are catered to children. Even food. Let's say if your office is keen, really good in doing food distribution, but you have children, like very young children, they cannot eat all the food that the adults eat. So even within, if you're doing food distribution, you have to adapt it to a demographic that's very big in almost all emergencies. Um, when it comes time for, like, let's say, psychosocial support, um, you can't have the same methodology of providing psychosocial support for adults as you do it with children. You have to adapt it. And the education emergencies basically provide this platform for almost all your responses to adapt it to children, because it's that type of platform. And that's one of the benefits of it, is because it's intersectoral. It can be linked to health. Let's say during education emergencies, kids are in a classroom. So as they are learning math, science, then there is time for hygiene promotion. You have, hygiene promoters come in and talk about health. Sometimes you have food security that can be implemented. So the children, during their break, then they can go out in the courtyard or where near, and they are given food so that they can stay in school, instead of worrying about, let's say, going to get going to work, or being unfortunately recruited by armed by armies, or people who want to do warfare. So in a sense, they are very, very protected when they are in the school environment. And I'll give you an example that I experienced myself. I was working for another organization in South Sudan, and we just started implementing education emergencies. So the villages that one of the villages that was very far in Upper Nile called us and say, please implement anything education related. So that was a community that was very, very hard to actually get through when it came time for showing them the importance of that early child marriage was not the answer for everything. So they saw the importance of education. Why? One of the benefit is when children were carrying backpacks, or they were carrying books, that the recruiters for both sides of the army, when they see kids with books, they actually didn't bother with them, because to them, it's harder to break a kid who's educated than to break a kid who's not educated. So they actually ask us, just bring anything you have, a book, a backpack, anything that's it's almost like anything that resembles school, because that creates a protection against armed recruitment. So that's why, education is very important. It's very practical, but and we have an opportunity to cater to that for children. So enough about the reason for education emergencies. So how do you do it? As an organization at ADRA, we have tools available. And just to simplify it, we have developed what Michael has already mentioned, what we call the Education Emergency Framework. And we also have developed a methodology that we want you to follow. Is just to give you a pathway in terms of, okay, this is how it would look like if there's an education emergency. If there's an emergency and one of the big gaps is education, this is how to respond to it. And I'm also going to talk about some best practices that we have. So for the sake of time, very quickly, I'll just go through what the education emergency framework is. Essentially, it's a unified approach that ADRA we need to have when responding to education and emergencies. There's a lot that can be done, but we want to develop a way for offices that that they have a central document, a living document that they can tap into and see what it looks like for ADRA to implement an education and emergency response. And it's based on international standards, and also includes some examples, so some best practices. So having that as part of your toolkit is very important, because even if there is an emergency happening and you see an opportunity or some funding available for education, then you can always have that available for you to say, okay, we have developed the framework. These are some examples. These are some indicators that we can use, and you use that as a resource for you to respond. And the purpose of it is to ensure that that we have a learning environment that's available even during times of crisis. And I just want to pause on that very quickly. Education is a human right. We cannot we cannot put a pause on education because it's an emergency. Everybody deserves safe safety and also education. Um, so when there's an emergency, just I think one of the key takeaways we need to remember is that if you have children who are being educated, emergency is not a license to say that education is not important anymore. What's most important is, of course, it's food, it's water. That's true, but education also has a role to play. When things are stable, this is what we can offer. So education is part of an emergency. When there's an emergency, you can implement education because it's a human right. And thankfully, we have the tools and the mechanism to do that. And one thing about education emergencies is the respect for localization. Um, when if you use, let's say, our framework, one of the key thing is not a sole dependence on external aid. It's about strengthening local capacity. It's about strengthening local resources, seeing the best practices and adapting them to their local context. And also what I like to say, number three, is almost like engineering a way for kids to learn. Kids are eager to learn. I've been to Uganda and I've seen kids with no teachers. All they had was a poster about, studying anatomy. And they had one teacher for, I'd say close to 1,000, not 1,000, but maybe 200 kids. And the teacher just had to go from one classroom to another. And I saw a group of kids that were sitting outside one of the classrooms because the classroom was too big. So she just put a mat outside, put a poster on anatomy. These are body parts. And she lit in front of me, she said, teach yourself. teach yourself these things. And she walked out. And these kids, very quiet, were taking notes and they were teaching themselves. These are the best times, let's say, for kids to focus on something positive and for them to learn. And it creates that stability, that continuation. Kids are in school most of their lives, so when there's a crisis and now there's a break and those continuation, then it becomes something very traumatic to them. So we need to keep that going. Um, and in terms of when we have the framework, so this is very busy, but it follows the basic workflow for any type of emergency. But in the context of education, um, the framework basically shares with you, okay, if you see a gap in education, then these are the how you can go about it. And it's very typical for an emergency, so I don't need to go through all of that, except pointing out that the importance of um, knowing your local context and your local partners. That means the governments, the local NGOs, anybody who is on the same page with you when it comes time to emergencies, get in touch with them. Also, I know a lot of offices struggle to find funding. And I can tell you that sometimes the best funding are in those local groups. Sometimes they're work groups, sometimes they're cluster groups. So by missing out on these meetings, you're also robbing yourselves of a lot of opportunities that can be easily given. And sometimes, because so many people are focused on food, so many people are focused on NFI, so many people are focused on livelihood, very few partners are actually focusing on education. So your competition to actually receive funding for education when they are presented in those groups is very high. So not not being part of the community, understanding or participating in those working groups, you're also robbing yourselves of a lot of opportunities for collaboration. Um, and it is not hard to do some of those programs or implement some of those programs. And the last part of this presentation, I want to talk to you about some of those programs that can easily be implemented if you see a gap in your local context when it comes time for emergencies. So one of them is something that's widely practiced is child-friendly spaces. And I like how Save the Children puts it. It says, child-friendly spaces are supervised environments in which parents and caregivers can leave their children while they collect food and water, rebuild homes, or seek new income-generating activities. There are places to provide care while family, community, and social structures are being restored. Parents are divided, let's say if they have to find food and leave their kids at home. I know Haiti was, a big context where during those displacements that have been happening because of gang violence, the kids had nowhere to go, so they stayed behind. Unfortunately, because they stayed behind, they were exposed. So there were a lot of sexual abuses that were happening because the parents were absent. Now, imagine with me if, let's say, Haiti, there's a lot of Adventist churches. What if we created a initial response plan where churches can be those safe places that while nobody's going to church during the weekdays, there is a space available for children who are caught up in those emergencies for them to be in the church playground, protected. Um, Parents can just drop them off while they are looking for other loved ones, while they are looking for income generating activity or shelter or getting food. What if they can drop off these kids in those safe spaces while they do that? Um, so it's a big opportunity for the child-friendly spaces for us to implement. If we partner with churches, our local churches, we can designate them to be a child-friendly space. That can be easily activated when there's an emergency. That the community knows that if it's activated, that they can go to these churches. We have game plans. We have adults that can protect them, that are trained in child protection, and preparing for these spaces to be activated when there's emergencies. Um, So this is one of the best practices that's widely used by UNICEF, Save the Children, World Vision, and a number of other organizations. It is not typical, I think, for ADRA. I know some offices have done that in the past, but it is not common to see something like that in ADRA. But especially if you want to build more relationship with your church, this is something that you can really collaborate with your churches and designate churches as child-friendly spaces, working with the local community and have them already designated for these purposes. Another idea is team sports. So having football games to help not only with mental health, because the kids are so stressed that they need relief, but it also provides opportunity for risk communications. Imagine you have 50 kids, and even those watching from the outside, all watching a game, and during halftime, you pause and you share with them, hey, this is hygiene, something about hygiene promotion. This is what you do if you are, if you need to reach out for help. And parents usually are there too. And you can use that as an opportunity to share, for instance, like during COVID, these are, the steps that you take for to prevent the spread of COVID. So there's a lot of opportunities that doing team sports that you can adapt it to the local crisis and the response, and you can integrate even other sectors in these activities. So for instance, this photo is taken from Ukraine. So a lot of those kids were so traumatized by the sound of bombing and gunshots, and they some of them were even involved in football. But so while they were sheltered in other places, so they met kids who were also going through these crises. So it became an opportunity for them to make new friends when they are so far away from their hometown. And talking about hometown, um, one of the best practices to supply school support. Um, when a disaster happens, some of those disasters actually the whole community has to leave. They leave a lot of things behind. Trust me, when people are rushing to escape, the last thing that's in their mind is to bring school books. I know as a child, I didn't like school, so I didn't want to study or do homework while I was away. So I will not bring my textbook with me if I'm running. So unfortunately, it's actually important. So imagine if we have a NEMP or initial response plan where we already have a mechanism like a cash transfer for parents who left the school uniforms behind or the school supplies behind, that we can give them so that they can use that to pay for school fees, to pay for exams, to pay for uniforms. That's very important in those local contexts. In some schools, like the photo that you have, that's taken from Nepal. Kids without uniforms are, in a sense, not regarded well. And I've been exposed to communities where when we ask the parents, what is it's just a uniform, it's not that important. No, the uniform says a lot. The kids are being picked on because they don't have the school uniform. So to them, it says they need the school uniforms. So imagine if we have a mechanism within your local context where you can support local schools. You can have a school kit available where the supplies can be very mobile. You can just drop them off at makeshift schools, and the books, the chalks, the notebooks, the pencils are already there. So kids can continue within their education. And even if you want to implement type of psychosocial support, you can also train teachers because they are dealing with kids who are traumatized. They don't know what to do. So you can also build local capacity on for teachers and teacher aides on how to respond to the local context. And I believe I was in Bahamas doing their hurricane oh, I see a question on the chat that says, can you describe what PSS is? PSS is psychosocial support. It's basically mental health services. I hope that helps. Yeah, and so for during the Bahamas crisis, not Bahamas crisis, Hurricane Dorian, um, there was a lot of needs for capacity building because the teachers, they were exposed to a lot of kids who are, displaced, traumatized, and so the curriculum that they currently have had a gap on how to respond to kids who are displaced. So when we provided education about, okay, this is how to support the teachers, so they took that in, and they felt more equipped to respond to the current disasters as opposed to not having it prior to the disaster. So one way you can support local schools is even training the teachers on how to respond to those local crises. Um, yeah, so I know within ADRA, we do have some other examples. So I don't know if we have anybody online who want to share some of those best practices on how to, uh, 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 when it comes time for education emergencies, how have you adapted to the local context for NEMP or initial response? Anybody has an example or even ideas? I want to hear from you. Okay, I don't think anybody has any ideas. Um, so hopefully that has been informative about the possibilities. And I do encourage you to look into the framework to find more ideas, more best practices. And so I guess with that, just want to share some resources that we have available. If you are not part of our Hub group, definitely go on it. We have webinars that can help support your local office, and also share some resources that we have in time when it comes to education and also emergencies. Something else that's really big within Azure, I know it's safeguarding and also child protection. And yeah, so child protection falls under education because education is so child-centered. So we have those resources available, including this webinar. We will make it available with the education emergency framework and all the resources that we have mentioned. Um, and also we have a child protection and education webinar that's happening next week, not next week, in a few weeks. So I do encourage you to participate. The link has been shared on the chat. So it is an opportunity for us to further expand our knowledge about how to respond to how to consider children when it comes time to for emergencies. And we also have resources on AdraNet about the NEMP and how to develop them. We have country offices that have NEMP menus already available. I know that there is a few, I believe maybe Thailand and Myanmar have examples of education emergency as part of their NEMP menu. There might be more that I'm not aware of. But these are all the resources that I encourage you to use. Lastly, I leave my email. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer. And I definitely encourage you to look more into your local context, and also remember that during times of emergencies, to remember children, that not all people who are displaced in crisis are adults between the age of 20 and 50 who are able-bodied. Um, like we saw in Ukraine crisis, the majority of the people who are displaced were children. So as an organization that's very child friendly, we have children on our materials. I think it's very crucial that we also cater to them when there is any type of emergency. So if you want to know more about, let's say, going down that path, definitely use those resources that are available. So I'm going to stop here. If you have any questions, we'll be more than happy to answer. And also want to invite anybody from from the Education Technical Learning Lab members, if they want to contribute, feel free to jump in. But yeah, I want to turn it over to Michael or Shind at this time. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Billy. Sorry, my Zoom keeps kicking me off. I just wanted to echo what Billy was saying there, particularly for country officers. To If you haven't looked at the framework, it's a very practical toolkit. It includes everything from the planning, the implementation, the reviewing, the evaluation, some of the standards, the commitments, the international commitments that we have and have subscribed to. But also a couple of points I want to raise around the concept of using education in emergencies is twofold. One is the ability to connect with the church. We're always looking at ways to partner with the churches in the work we do in countries, particularly during disasters. In many of the countries too, we do have a strong education network with the Adventist Church. It's one of the largest Protestant education networks in the world. And when we are looking at ways to engage with the church in disasters, education is yet another possibility to explore, whether it's the child-friendly spaces that Billy was talking about, whether it's protracted crises. They're good conversations to have with the church around using the church institutions, the history that the church has with education, from primary, secondary, and tertiary. So there's opportunities there. The other element I want to flag too is the concept of bridging the nexus. We're always looking at ways to effectively transition from disaster response into recovery and then longer term development. Education can be a really powerful narrative to help us address the nexus. Billy also mentioned the concept of peace building. A lot of work going on in Europe too. We just had a meeting with ADRA Denmark last week. They've been doing some fantastic work around peace building using education, particularly in Africa. So there's some examples there that can be explored too if you're wanting to consider maybe not a NEMP response, but a larger protracted crisis where you are looking at education as something that maybe a significant response into recovery and into longer term development. Lastly, I just want to flag too that the guidelines or the framework that we've been talking about today has a couple of pages there on how do we integrate ERT surge capacity. When we deploy people to a disaster, people from a neighbouring country, ADRA staff from the region, or global ADRA ERT personnel, and we send those to support a country office for a larger disaster. We want you to be aware of these guidelines, these frameworks, because you can keep a copy of these in your back pocket and look at ways that you can be better integrated with the country officer's program, how you can scale things up, how you can look at leveraging some of the work that's already existing there. So just want to flag that the guidelines and the framework are a really useful tool and worth downloading a copy of. See the copy that Billy shared has been desktop published by ADRA International, so make sure you use that copy and not the one that I circulated earlier, which is the final draft. It's the Word version. Any last questions? We've got 10 minutes. Any examples that people might want to share where they have used it? Do we have any on the chat? I know Sophia's here. I think Syria was one of the countries that were used for the $300,000 COVID RFA that we did in 2021. Maybe there's some examples that can be shared there of where this has worked well or what we can learn from. Oh, there's some stuff in the chat too. Let me just open my chat. Okay, good. Oh, there's some new safeguarding policies from Beryl. We can make sure those are updated. Thank you, Beryl. Thank you, Prabuk. Beryl says education emerges a great response area. Just need to make sure officers follow safe recruitment practices. Agreed, particularly working with children. Echo the point that Billy made earlier too around the Ukraine response. I was there in those first couple of weeks on the border with Poland, and the majority of people that were coming across the border were children. Many of them unaccompanied and in particularly vulnerable situations. Moving on to having to access school in Poland. Um, and looking at ways for cash transfers too to be used there for them to buy school uniforms, school bags, etc., to be able to integrate into the Polish education system. So really simple, practical ways there that we can leverage a disaster response mechanism on a much larger scale. All right, any other questions, observations?
I see a question from Prabuk. He asks, do you plan also to provide some guidance on education emergencies as part of anticipatory action? No, that's a short answer, but I think a lot of the principles can still be adapted to education emergencies. It requires a lot of collaboration with local actors. So if, let's say, you anticipate El Nino is going to come in, and you know that the schools in the area, they're not safe. These are some of the things that can be that you can start addressing. um, and I think one of the NEMP activities in terms of identifying, let's say, the local needs and what as an organization we can do, a lot of it is very tied into anticipatory action. So I'd say the principles are very close and the same. So I do encourage, let's say, for you to do that, even though we don't have a specific mandate yet to, let's say, craft something for anticipatory action, but the principles are are the same. So yeah, so I hope that that helps. Um, there's a question from Edward. He asks, are there best practices for multicultural, multilingual education emergencies out of local context challenges to deal with at least 3 or 4 languages and cultures? Um, the best advice I can give you is sports. Children tend to know the language of sports, language of football, language of games, even though I mean, during the World Cup, people playing against each other don't know the same language. You have people who speak Arabic, speaking with people who speak Swahili, not speaking, playing with people who speak Swahili or different languages, but the game is still the same. The rules are the same. So I'd say implement activities and games to help in those local contexts. Kids are very adaptable. They always find a way around. So I'd say physical activities would be one of the best methods, let's say, for to deal with multicultural practices. And one thing I want to mention too is that, when we mention sports, also remember girls in those sports, that they're not so much like male focused, but also create space for women focused activities, or multi-gender if the culture allows it. So I hope that that helps. Brooke has a comment. I don't know if it's a question, but you mentioned that um, there were Oxfam had provided watertight bags to children to protect their books just before flooding. Exactly. So providing those items, I think, is good. Um, yeah, like I think the principle is that if when we're thinking about anticipatory actions, just like when we're thinking about NEMP activations or initial responses, do not forget the children. Do not forget the facilities that they typically go to, or do not forget, what they need. So if education is important, providing any materials or protection for materials when we anticipate a disaster that's about to come. So thank you for that example, Prabhu. Definitely insightful.
All right. Any last comments, further insights? I really like the concept of looking at this from an anticipatory action perspective. Thanks, Prabhu. I think that's something we can go away and look at further. And we'll update the safeguarding and protection stuff there. I'll appreciate that. Look, if there's nothing further, then my final encouragement to each of you is to get a copy of the framework. Some really good examples there. Some useful guidance as you design and implement your various humanitarian actions, and also considering this in the in the preparedness phase, because a lot of this comes into the risk reduction and resilience space too. So the more we can position ourselves in that space, the more economically efficient our disaster responses are too. So education can be a powerful narrative in that space. All right. Thank you to Chanda. She's making this available as a recording. We'll make sure all the resources are available for you on HumHub as well. And also another opportunity for us to use the new HumHub platform a little bit more effectively too. So if not, please continue to use NEMP. It's available there as well, some of these things, but we'll put as much as we can on HumHub. All right. Thank you to those who've joined. I appreciate you taking an hour out of your days to meet with us and to share. And if you have any questions, please reach out to Billy or myself, and we will point you in the right direction. Thank you, Billy, for preparing the slides and for presenting. And I wish all of you a wonderful day, and please be in touch. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.